Les Dawson was one of Britain's most successful comedians. In an exceptional career spanning almost 30 years, he entertained the nation with his unique brand of humour.
I am the greatest! I am the greatest!
But there was more to Les Dawson than meets the eye.
It's not good enough. Get stuck in! Where would we be without a laugh? Here.
Hiding behind this lugubrious, self-deprecating character lay a very private man who never publicly revealed his true feelings. But secretly, he had been writing them down. Now, for the first time, unprecedented access to his candid diaries allows us a glimpse into the private fears of the real Les Dawson. A performer driven by a never-ending dread of failure, and a man haunted by an extraordinary past.
I've not had a happy life. My childhood was a singularly unhappy one. The trouble was my mother was short-sighted, and she would persist in keep putting talcum powder on my face. Between you and I, I've often shuddered to think what she did with me dummy.
Les Dawson had this sort of constant sense of disappointment that I always have related to, which he was so good at communicating.
We lived in a tough district. It was so tough I got mugged one night by a nun.
Really and truly, he was just more or less portraying a natural him. You know, downtrodden, giving this gloomy look and all this business, but that was him all over.
Les Dawson's comic melancholy was no accident. It was born out of a real life of struggle and disappointment, and it produced some of comedy's most realistic deadpan characters.
I'll tell you something, as soon as I get out of it, I'm going straight round to the police.
Why? Whatever for?
I'm reporting that fella next door.
Oh, yes?
He's always walking about the living room in the nude.
Yes.
He is. Large as life.
Whenever I watched that Sissy and Ada sketch that he did on television, it always brought me back to the Collier's days, because it was full of them in every street, and you'd see people like that all the time. Honestly, two ladies that was carrying on like Sissy and Ada.
It's very much a matriarchal society, and I think this is one of the reasons that Dad had such an affinity for like the Ada type character, because he grew up with women like that in his street. You know, they ruled the roost sort of thing, you know, they clipped the kids over the ears if they were misbehaving and so on. And he grew up with that tremendous strength of women.
I don't know, but come on in here, you. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. Get in there, you.
My mother always kind of pulled her face a wee bit. She showed disappointment and what have you, and he was always taking my mother off. So Sissy and Ada really came from my mum and my auntie Sissy.
Oh, certainly God, don't look, Sissy, don't look.
What are you playing at?
Don't look.
You great, I think I can't see the lists.
My auntie was exactly like what they was. They used to talk through the side of their mouth, especially if children was there listening to them. They'd spell it all out.
I mean, he's been through the mill, that matters, you know.
Course, yeah.
During the war, you know.
He swore that was based on close sociological research into the habits, linguistic habits of the factory workers in Lancashire mills.
They would mouth to each other because they couldn't quite hear each other. So they all became expert lip readers.
You can lip read, can't you?
Yeah. When they want to know time, no, they'll say.
And of course there was the primness and the prudery if you didn't say certain words.
Even now, woman's trouble.
Cast against such strong female characters was a young Les Dawson, struggling to grow up in the harsh streets of a working-class Manchester.
You don't get many comics from stockbroker belts, do you? You don't get many comics who have a long background of successful accountancy, but you get comics from hard, grim streets, don't you? And that's what Les certainly was.
In Collier's, if you had a cat with a tail, everybody thought he was posh. It was rough, it was tough, and the people that came from here were tough.
There was a saying that you'd either made a good footballer, a boxer, or a thief. So most of them became good footballers and boxers because the thieves in those days, you got hard labour, and nobody wanted to do that.
Les Dawson followed the accepted social path, entering the macho world of the boxer, but his diary entries from the time reveal a reluctance and fear consuming him. It was a fear of failure that would dominate his life.
We touch gloves. My heart pounds within me. My blood surges madly in my temples. My stomach trembles. Thoughts run wildly through my head. Will I lose?
He had a very strong upper body and shoulders, so he lent himself as a boxer. But he wasn't terribly good. I mean, he used to joke he had handles sewn onto his shorts so they could carry him out of the ring.
Sweat, grunt, thud of gloves against flesh, and a quickening of one's breath, which is then the end. What is the verdict? I lose on points. Dejected, I leave the ring. My friends say hard luck and so forth, but 'tis of no avail. I have lost.
Les Dawson's diary reveals that any affection for boxing was overshadowed by a more powerful passion, one he'd been secretly hiding for years, a love of writing. On the outside he appeared one of the lads, but this was just a facade. Inwardly, he was different.
There were a few things that set Les apart from the rest of his contemporaries in Collyhurst, but not least of all was the fact that he kept a diary, and it really was unusual for a young boy to keep a diary so consistently.
Within the pages of the secret diaries was an even more unusual indulgence. The Collyhurst boxer had a passion for poetry.
The dead they hath now arisen from their cold, narrow prison. Hath they then arrived in sorrow into this life of perilled morrow?
To be seen as a thinker within that masculine working class world sometimes was a very dangerous thing. It set you up as an outsider. It set you up as the worst thing you could possibly be. Different.
Well, if I thought Les Dawson would have been writing poetry when he was only 13, 14, people would have looked at him and perhaps many of them would have ostracised him. You wouldn't have known what he was doing, poetry. We couldn't even spell it.
Poetry was for girls, do you know what I mean? So the only poetry you come out to was when you got a girl on a date, then you come out with a little bit of poetry, because it was harder then to get them into bed.
With a pronounced leaning towards philosophy, I found myself a complete rebel to conformity, a rebel against progress, in fact most everything. I'm utterly alone.
Les Dawson's private isolation was a complete secret, his unhappiness hidden from the world, as was his desire to break out of the confines of his life in Collyhurst.
I'm determined to break away from this way of life, a life of absolute dreariness, and try to rise from the mire.
It was highly unusual to break out of your class or even your geographical area. Everybody knew their social position. Les Dawson, on the other hand, was somebody who very, very clearly wouldn't be happy with that lot in life.
Les Dawson was about to begin his escape, but the path to success would be littered with turmoil and tragedy.
Isn't it strange how sometimes the saddest of faces can belong to one of the funniest people? Well, that's certainly the case with my next guest, honestly, because he's always making people laugh just by telling them everything about his bad luck. You know, he tells you a sad tale, and you break down laughing. Well, I can't wait to introduce you to Les Dawson.
By the time this sour-faced man finally graced our screens in the 1960s, he'd turned a life of struggle and disappointment into his recipe for success.
His own particular brand of humour, and to make his mark cost him a lot, though ultimately he was successful.
I knew it was going to be a rotten day when I saw my bank statement. As soon as I saw the envelope, I knew damn well it was from the bank because it was pinned to the front door with the wreath.
When he looked at them with that world-weary face, they just knew what he'd been through and they suffered and they loved him for it.
A career in television would never have entered Les's most fanciful daydreams when he first plucked up courage to leave Collyhurst. Back then, he yearned to be a writer. For a romantic like Les, there was only one place to go.
Tomorrow I go alone to Paris. Alone in a foreign city would be hell, but go I must. My life must alter, and I swear it will. Manhood I must achieve or continue my mental hell.
I think it was really excitement for him. It was a bit of a change, Paris from Colliers, wasn't it?
I went to Paris to be a writer. To me, I thought that was a place you should gravitate, because Paris is really Birmingham with soot. There's too many distractions in Paris, too many things to detract you from you know. There's the smell of cheap wine, there's the women.
His trip to Paris did little for his writing career, but it did provide him with a character-defining story that would become a staple of his act.
To supplement his meagre income, I don't think he had any income at the time, he got a job playing the piano in this very exotic place, and this lady kept asking him to play. He said he could never see any customers, he didn't know what was going on, he thought it was just a bar. But of course all the action was going on behind the bar, because it was a brothel.
Where were you at the time when the others...
Well, I wore blinkers.
According to Les, he spent months working in this brothel to subsidise his bohemian lifestyle. An exceptional story for a 25-year-old Collyhurst lad.
Les seems to have built up over the years this amazing myth about his time in Paris. And I really have to say that I find a lot of it very hard to swallow. I don't doubt that he went to Paris, but I'd be intrigued to know exactly for how long he went.
His secret diaries indicate that he was in Paris for only 10 days. Drunkenly played the piano in a bar and spent the rest of the time sightseeing. Not quite the romantic tale he would tell many times. As a route to becoming a published author, his road trip was a failure. But he didn't return empty-handed. He brought back the seed of a comic reinvention.
Whatever the truth about Les Dawson's stay in Paris, no matter how long it was or how successful he was in Paris, the important thing is that he turned it round, and that story becomes part of the Les Dawson myth.
Les Dawson returned to Collyhurst a failed writer, penniless and dejected. But the desire to escape hadn't left him. A developing gift for storytelling and music were about to offer him a very different route out.
Play the piano and the Lord love it all night. Lashings of booze and song. Boys and I go to Lee Road Club. Booze heavily and give a couple of songs in a bawdy place.
After gaining something of a reputation around town, Les Dawson was booked as a comic entertainer on the infamous Northern Working Men's Circuit. Tough and unforgiving, they were to be the making of the man.
Working men's clubs, especially in the north, dared you to be funny.
They used to call them cesspits, and you used to dread playing those. I've seen comics sneaking out of the building through the window.
7373 80 blank.
For Les, it was a baptism of fire. For most of these clubs, bingo was king, the entertainer a legitimate target. Night after night, he died on stage, and increasingly would drown his sorrows at the bar.
I'm a paid artist at the Buff Lodge. Bags of ale, but I'm nearly a flop. Try a bit of comedy. No one laughs.
The problem with Les in clubs was he wasn't a fast-talking joke salesman. Come here, I've got another one for you. If you don't laugh at that, I'll tell you another one. He didn't do that, and also the kind of language he used was too erudite. It was too, often too clever.
As the moon rode forlornly across a cloud-flecked sky, it cast a pool of jaundiced illumination onto a weed-choked mound of damp earth.
The rambling monologues clearly demonstrate a frustration at being an unpublished author. This explosion, the volcano of words, is down to sheer frustration.
I can remember him telling me once, he said he went to this club, and afterwards he went to the bar, and this man came up to him and said, "Were you the turn?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Ah, well, can you take a bit of constructive criticism?" He said, "Yes." "What is it?" And the fellow said, "I think you're crap."
Well, tonight Jess and I face the tough skippers at the St Andrew Club. We go on and play to a real tough audience. I sup stacks of ale, but Jess and I flop, I'm afraid.
Working these bars and clubs every night put a massive strain on his confidence. Crushed by nightly humiliation, to numb the pain, he often turned to the bottle.
He loved a drop of scotch. I say a drop of scotch, I mean, Les could drink a bottle of whiskey and it would have no effect on him, as far as I could see.
He used to travel with a suitcase. It was a small one. At one time, you could buy them for about sixpence in Woolworths, and he would walk into the dressing room, put it on the top, and you'd be chatting to him, and he'd open it up and he'd pour 2 glasses out and says, "What do you want with it?" He never ever said, do you want a drink?
Most people like that tended to drink quite a lot. And I think it also was a question of Dutch courage and on dimming the senses, when you didn't feel the pain so much when somebody's giving you the bird.
After weeks of heavy drinking and in different audiences, he was in despair.
A futile existence, no future, no past, and a hateful present. Come fill my brimming tankard of failure.
But one particular night of excess, he later claimed, would change his act forever.
I did the time-honoured mistake of going for a few drinks, and I drank more than I should have done.
Right. This
So
was
that
before
night,
your shift?
Yes, that night I got the piano. Then it's a great pleasure to be in this Kipper depot, and found that I was playing off key. Terrible things like that. Started telling about my life and how bad things were, and for the first time in my checkered career, somebody clapped in the corner, a little bald-headed man clapped in the corner. I said, "Thank you for clapping." He said, "I'm not clapping, I'm slapping my head to keep awake." But then I started to get a few laughs, and that's how it started.
Les would have us believe that, fueled by whiskey, he had inadvertently hit on this brilliant comic style.
I suspect there's a bit of embellishment in that story because, one, Les could hold his liquor. Boy, I don't think I ever saw him drunk. The second thing is that Les would always be able to play the piano well. I always felt that he was in control of everything that he did in that way.
Try to keep together.
You don't develop an act as sharp and as tight as Les Dawson's overnight on a whim because you're drunk. He worked at it for years and years and years. He honed it and he got it down to perfection.
Perhaps this was another example of Les Dawson's mythical stories. But whatever the truth, his natural comic abilities coupled with this new musical style led to bigger and more regular bookings. Between his day job as a Hoover rep, he continued to hone his act and his self-confidence soared. His biggest break came when he got called to go to London and work with the great Max Wall. Finally, fame and fortune seemed destined.
Ah, success inflames my senses. Great send-off from the boys. I leave Hoover, sell the car, and prepare for the unknown.
The Max Wall Show.
Max Wall was a massive star at the time. And he signed Les. Les went to see him, and anyway, bottom line was, Max Wall said he'd get him some work.
He didn't have to wait long before Max Wall offered Les his first TV appearance. He couldn't believe his luck.
A call from Max at the theatre. Would I like to go on TV this Sunday?
But just when things finally seemed to be going his way, disaster struck. Max Wall, a married man, was discovered to be having an affair with a beauty queen. Consumed by scandal, Wall's career instantly went belly up, and with it went Les's telly break.
Friday the 13th, the date which marks the finish of any ambitions I may have conceived would happen. Max Wall, after all his promises and hopes for me, turned to me in his dressing room and said it would be better if I gave up the whole idea. Stunned, I left and walked the streets of London, alone and dazed. What shall I do? Where can I go? My philosophy of life is now clearly etched. I don't give a damn whatever happens. I'll never bother about anything again.
I think it was a serious letdown. Perhaps the biggest setback he felt that he'd had.
After Max Wall's promise of stardom was dramatically taken away from him, he found himself in London, alone and once again penniless. Too ashamed to go back to Manchester and face his friends and family, he spent the next few months desperately trying to fight disappointment and find himself work.
Money short, I trudge around the streets of this hostile city, banging on agents' doors. The nights are lonely and dreary. I grow more melancholy and my clothes more shabby. Am I destined for failure? My head whirls and the spirit dies.
He was feeling quite rejected at that time in his life and feeling let down, really, letting his mum and dad down because they kept saying, you know, you've got to get a proper job. You can't keep doing this. And he was almost, well, he said it, you know, he felt like committing suicide.
What does a man do when his dreams crash around him? Am I indeed destined to failure? All is indeed lost now, wasted, and I could willingly die.
Suffering acute depression and with a string of failures to his name, Les Dawson was a broken man. Ironically, the man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders was about to captivate the nation. After his London expedition had imploded in failure, Les Dawson returned home to Manchester and picked up where he had left off, working dead-end sales jobs by day and hammering away at the pub piano by night. But in 1959, he met Meg Plant, a woman who was to change his life and career forever.
He was very, very fond of Meg, his wife, and in fact, Meg was the boss. No question. At home, he was henpecked.
Like the strong matriarchal women that surrounded his childhood, Meg provided the strength and support that Les needed to help him get back on his feet. More than that, she provided his driving force, motivating him to act on his ambitions.
Well, here I stand, a married man with a history of partial failures and disappointments. A self-deprecating individual, yet to make anything of himself. And more importantly by far, yet to prove himself to his wife.
It was the feisty determination of Meg Plant that would eventually provide Les Dawson with the big break he desperately needed.
Dad had been doing the clubs for some years by this time and not getting very far. And there was an advert in the newspaper for obviously auditions for Opportunity Knocks, which was Huey Green at the time. So Mum, unknowns to Dad, actually wrote in a sort of application, got the application form for him. He came home and he went, you know, what am I going to do? You're going for it, do it.
It's Opportunity Knocks.
Margaret had that determination behind her. She was going to push him up there, and if they didn't make it this time on Opportunity Knocks, that was going to be it. That was the last choice. You know, let's get you on Opportunity Knocks, and if Huey Green can't do it for you, well, nobody can.
Thank you, friends, and welcome once again to Manchester. Welcome to Opportunity Knocks.
Hosted by Huey Green, the talent show Opportunity Knocks gave a primetime TV audience their first glimpse of Les Dawson, and they liked what they saw. Thanks to Meg, finally he was on the road to success.
Good evening, fun hunters. I must confess that I never expected to hear prolonged bursts of enthusiastic applause when my name was announced. I wasn't far wrong either.
Once the general show business area saw Les on that screen, they started booking him and putting him into theatres. And when they started putting him into his theatres, he came into his own because there he got an audience that had paid to come in to see Les Dawson.
The years of struggle in the pubs and clubs finally over, he started topping the bill in theatres around the country. 3 years later, he was offered his very own prime-time show.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Says Les.
He had arrived, but he'd taken his time. When Says Les hit our screens, Les Dawson was already 38 years old.
There is a phrase in show business, isn't it, an overnight success. Well, Les's probably took about 20 years before that fully formed Les Dawson appeared on our screens.
One of my neighbours, a couple of months ago, petitioned for a divorce on the grounds that her husband was careless about his appearance at home. The solicitor said, "How do you mean he's careless about his appearance?" She said, "I haven't seen him for 5 years."
Every week on Says Les, the television audience were treated to the type of material that would become his trademark.
I've got my mother-in-law with me tonight. She's outside in the car. I would have brought her to see the show, but I've lost the keys to the boot.
Les nailed his colours to the mast with the mother-in-law.
I haven't spoken to a wife's mother for 5 years. It's not been a row, it's just I'm not quick enough to interrupt.
When he married Margaret Plant, little did her mother Ada know that she was to become the most famous mother-in-law in this country. The irony was he actually loved his mother-in-law, he loved Ada.
I heard this knock on the front door, and I knew damn well it was the wife's mother because the mice were throwing themselves on the traps. The wife said, "Mummy's here, how would you like to speak to her?" I said, "Through a spiritualist."
They would have been awful had he not had a pretty good marriage. But as he did have a pretty good marriage, that was part of the reason I think that they were, by and large, accepted.
Oh, my mother loved it when she was mentioned in his act. I mean, she just loved the mother-in-law jokes because she would say, "Well, I've made it myself, haven't I? I'm in fame." But she obviously hadn't realised he was talking in general.
I haven't seen a face like it for 5 years. She was a model for oven gloves.
By the late 70s, Les Dawson was one of Britain's highest-earning entertainers and finally had the opportunity to escape his humble Manchester background.
When he was on Opportunity Knock, they lived in a small bungalow, and when it hit the time, coming into the money, they decided then they would go for the house, and they always wanted to live at St Anne's in Blackpool.
We used to aspire to something like this, but we didn't have the money in those days. We lived in a house that was so small, you know, when you turned the light on, I was in bed before it was dark. So it's nice to have something around you that you can move freely in and feel at home in.
Les liked celebrity, he liked fame, and he liked being of the establishment. I think that was part of a process of continuing acceptance as far as he was concerned, and I think was quite emotionally, psychologically important to him.
I think if you've got nice things around, you feel it's nice to relax amongst your things. Is that not exactly like living up to your blue china, as Oscar Wilde would say. I think if you're not careful, possessions can take you over, you know.
Les was mesmerised by show business. He loved it. He loved the attention. And I think that's how he was with it, you know. I think he just entered this world of stardom and I'm on my way sort of attitude to it.
Even now, with his bank account overflowing and his name familiar in every household, Les Dawson couldn't shed the insecurities he'd grown up with.
I remember going to play golf with him once at his club in Blackpool, and the captain came up and said, "Will you present the prizes for my son's school in the summer?" And I said, "Well, if I'm here, I will. You know, I might be in summer season somewhere, but if I'm here, I'll do it." And I said to him, when the fellow walked away, I said, "You get a lot of that then, do you now?" He said, "All the time, Jim." And he said, "I wouldn't care. If I wasn't a star, they wouldn't let me in this bloody club."
With wry amusement, I wonder how I got here. Me, Les Dawson, slum kid, boxer, insurance agent, pub pianist, singer, oftentimes failed writer and poet. A narrative of dead-end jobs as I went on, always dreaming. Failure, but always a dreamer.
Les Dawson's dreams had seemingly come true, but the success he fought so hard to achieve hadn't brought the happiness he'd hoped for. A never-ceasing fear of past failure haunted him, plaguing him with doubt and panic.
When he became a star, I think he still had this memory there of, I'll walk out there and somebody might not want to hear me again, you know.
My whole being was a tremble with dire forebodings and doubts about my abilities. I started to recall the nights when the club audiences booed me off. I remember the times bottles were thrown at me, the The times when I stood on a rostrum in smoke-wreathed venues with sweat dripping down my suit as a battle to be heard over the din.
He used to worry enormously about any indication, possible indication that his popularity is waning. He used to worry about the number of fan letters he used to get. Worry enormously about it.
Every performance, he was still that little bit worried about how it would go. Rather than most people who achieved his success would have just expected it, you know, and he didn't really expect it, or he wasn't sure.
Les hid this insecurity behind a seemingly relaxed and improvised act. He exuded confidence, apparently making it all up as he went along, but that was just part of the act.
He gave the appearance, when he was doing his act, of it being improvised, of it being not thought about, not planned. It seemed to be spontaneous and new-minted. It wasn't. It was very, very carefully rehearsed.
Yes? I'm Nettles.
Well, don't get prickly with me, young man.
No, he had that wonderful gift, the same as Eric Morecambe, of making it seem so spontaneous. And they were very similar men in that respect. Every syllable was learnt. They'd even rehearse ad-libs.
I beseech you, madam, on my knees, I beseech you, contrite and humble, I will do anything to live in Jersey.
Are you sure you're an actor?
Never, in the 7 or 8 shows I did with him, did he deviate ever from the script, from what we planned and from what we rehearsed.
His career insecurities were also reflected in the workload. By the mid-80s, he'd hosted over 100 primetime TV shows, as well as regular panto and theatre performances. Terrified that the next job might be his last, he was working himself into the ground.
I think Les Dawson's definitely a person haunted by his past. If you've not known where the next meal is coming from, years later, and you are a success, that is something you do not want to go back to, and it would drive anybody and keep them going.
Tomorrow you might not have a job, so you've got to do everything that's offered. You've got to work, whether it's good, bad or indifferent, as a matter of fact. Some of his choices weren't of the best, it has to be said. But he would work all the hours God sent him.
This unceasing need to work was beginning to take its toll on one part of his life he seemed to take for granted, the family.
Dear Meg was urging me to slow down, but something inside of me wouldn't let me stop the relentless workload.
Margaret was not one for going around with him on the circuit. She obviously had the children, and she was the homemaker, and I don't think Margaret was really impressed by all the glamour. She was the girl who wanted to be at home, but I suppose underneath, if you was to analyse it all, she would have not envied us, but in a way thinking, oh, they're at home with their guys, and here's me on my own at night waiting for him coming in at 2 and 3 in the morning.
Yeah, we used to get tired of not seeing Dad. And one particular time he'd been away a lot, and it was this prize Mercedes, bless him, and it was in the garage. And my brother and I decided we'd come up with this harebrained scheme. Bearing in mind I'd be, 6? And my brother was 4. And we came up with this scheme. If we glued the tyres to the garage floor, he couldn't go away. Our thinking was that if he couldn't move the car, he couldn't go.
It would only be years later when he finally realised how his drive for success had really affected his family.
I found myself feeling guilty about the weeks I'd spent away from home whilst trying to make a career. How I regretted my thirst for ambition, and how I wished now that all these days and nights we'd spent apart could be brought back.
Les Dawson's ambition seemed unquenchable. When the chance came finally to confirm his place at the top of the entertainment hierarchy, he grabbed at it, no matter what the consequences of the additional workload.
Les's real fame was really cemented by Blankety Blank, I think, where he was in control. Les Dawson turned it into Les Dawson Show, also known as Blankety Blank.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Blankety Blank, the BBC programme which has proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is life after drivel.
Blankety Blank was the ideal medium for Les because it sort of was this slightly pretentious show that sent itself up, and Les completely just pulled the rug away from it all and showed it up for what it was.
You still have the sort of prizes, believe me, that prizes that you have to pay a burglar to steal. But this is not the point of the show. The show is having fun, and one day we're going to find it.
But as with much of Les's life, the success he achieved came at a price. At the pinnacle of his fame, events in his personal life were taking a turn for the worse, and he was once again finding consolation in a bottle.
He'd walk down and he used to do this comedy trip. And I used to think, yeah, that's happened for real first time. And I'd hear him talking to the contestants, and I knew he'd had rather more than he should have done. But the public could never tell.
During the making of the second series, Les Dawson's world was falling apart. His wife Meg had been battling cancer and had just been given a matter of months to live.
Thank God I was working, otherwise my heart would have broken. I was drinking too much and punishing myself. Thoughts tormented me constantly. Was I doing enough for her?
You see, Meg was so strong with him. He was so dependent on her that when she became very ill, it really shattered him.
Well, Margaret was definitely his rock. She was his soulmate in every way. I mean, they just gelled together. And I think, you know, Margaret being ill was a real crush for him.
The audience saw the little fat man make them laugh. What they didn't see was the fat man in the dressing room, alone with his tortured thoughts as he repeatedly phoned home to ask how much pain his wife was in.
The suffering was plain to see. He was drinking a lot. He was depressed, obviously, and he went on every night and did it. And as I say, it was wonderful to be with him. And I never ever knew him give less than 100%, even in those circumstances. I would have walked off. I would have gone home. I would have gone away. I would have done something, anything but be in the public gaze and pretend to be funny, you know, or actually be funny, because it's a kind of dreadful irony. All those people laughing and that person dying.
My wife came second in the north of England Miss Refuse Disposal contest. I met her on top of a tip. Our song is still the same. 'Twas on a pile of debris that I...
2 months after this episode was recorded, Les Dawson's wife, Meg, passed away. In 1986, Meg Dawson died. Despite being the butt of many a Dawson gag, she had been the cornerstone of his life. She'd been the catalyst for his TV success, and over 25 years had provided the support he needed to survive his tormented past. After her death, Les's world fell apart.
Well, after Meg had died, I remember my husband and myself going over to see Les, and I was quite shocked to see how he was bearing up. He was really depressed, dishevelled, hardly eating anything. Really and truly, his heart had gone out of the man. Definitely, he'd lost his heart.
He went grey overnight, and I think that's when he started. I think that's only when it really hit him on his own mortality.
Frequently, I found myself sliding into depression, and a feeling of what the hell is life about soured my outlook. After taping a show, I'd get the driver to take me to the West End, to the clubs, and there, in those dimly lit places, I would drink to excess. I was at a very low ebb.
Les was lost without the love and guidance of his wife. He settled into a familiar pattern of heavy drinking and late nights. Amongst the regular haunts was the St. Ives Hotel, and it was there he finally found a sympathetic shoulder to cry on.
He was hitting every bar in town, and it's public record that, you know, he started to confide all in a beautiful, buxom barmaid who he met.
It was very hard for him, you know, so he would pop in an odd time, so we got, you know, we would talk about the illness that Meg had.
I found myself spending more time in the St. Ives Hotel. It was no good kidding myself. She was a sympathetic listener, and she seemed to care.
I just noticed he wanted to talk to me more, you know, and then when I wasn't in, he'd leave a little note. Les popped in to see you, you know, and he wouldn't have a drink, which I thought was quite strange, yeah, so... But he actually said to me, one day I'm going to marry you, lady.
They began a relationship which immediately set tongues wagging. It had only been a matter of months since Meg's death, and Tracy was 17 years his junior. Les worried that adverse public reaction might affect his bookings.
Les came from a generation where these things could bring people's careers down, as it did Max Wall.
Max Wall was the biggest comedy star of his day until he fell in love with a beauty queen over 20 years his junior. The newspapers and the morality of the day destroyed his career almost overnight. Here I sat at the top of my profession, facing the same situation. Would my love for Tracy destroy me?
To my mind, he was a guy who couldn't have been on his own. He certainly needed company.
He needed to be with someone, he needed to be happy, and as I say, he enjoyed being married despite the gags.
Despite the potential risks to his career, in 1989, Les and Tracy were married. With a strong woman once again at his side, his personal life seemed back on track, and he had a new spring in his step. But while Les Dawson was privately more secure, his career was about to get its biggest knockback. The world of comedy had moved on, and the comedy style Les had pioneered was in danger of getting left behind.
Old Toby comes on, there he goes, good old Toby, winking a smile for every honest English person. On he comes, doing that great gag about having a gap between his teeth. Fantastic stuff, Toby. Brilliant material, well worth 25 years at the top of the showbiz golfing tree.
It became very old hat to have a bow tie, and you were either one of the alternative brigade or you were with the bow tie end of the peer comedians. And for the end of the peer comedians, it was the end of the line, really. And Les was very worried about it and thought, well, that's it, you know, I don't know what's going to happen to me.
I could see bad times ahead for the older comedians. I'd noticed with regret that I no longer packed them in when I did the cabaret dates. And even to myself, I sounded ancient.
The previous generation of comedians, like Les Dawson, they were all put into one bag and classified as the old lot. And it's really sad that that happened.
Ironically, this change in comedy gave Les Dawson the chance he needed to explore a side few people knew. Throughout his comedy career, he'd been harbouring a desire to be taken seriously.
Les certainly had this serious sort of closet intellectual side to him. I mean, in his study, in his home, lined with you know, some pretty serious, heavy books.
He read a bit of Nietzsche now and again and used to come out with extraordinary theories. And like a lot of comics, he had a great wish, a desire to become an actor, legit actor.
Stop that man!
He wasn't just the fast-talking joke teller.
Hello, Mrs. Stanley.
So it's you, Josie.
He did have a serious side, and you know, the acting was a way of bringing that side of him out.
You look as though you need to buy me a very large drink.
Only now, it seemed, could Les Dawson truly fulfil the desire shown in his earliest unpublished diaries, the desire to write. By 1990, without disturbing too many bestseller lists, he'd already published a dozen novels.
He was very proud of his writing, and he used to say to me, if anything happens to me and I die, I always wanted to be remembered for my writing, and if you make that quite clear to people, I'll be very happy.
Ladies and gentlemen, Les Dawson!
Although his departure into serious acting and writing afforded him some success, for Les, it was never enough. Driven by a constant search to find fulfillment, he continued to work himself into the ground, taking anything from quiz shows to pantos. Even his failing health couldn't slow him down.
The workload was terrific. It really was, and he didn't spare himself in this regard. He did lots and lots and lots of work, and as a reaction to that, I think he used to enjoy himself. He used to work hard and play hard, as the cliche is, but he really did work very, very hard, and he played very, very hard as well.
He was, of course, a heart attack waiting to happen, bless him. I mean, his size, and he liked to drink, and he was a very, very heavy smoker through most of his life.
Since his rise to success, he'd been suffering from a number of health problems related to the years of overindulgence and overwork. In 1993, during a routine checkup in hospital, Les had a sudden, massive heart attack. He died instantly. He was 62 years old. Despite a long and impressive career that took him to the top of his profession, Les Dawson died as he had lived, a man forever trying to escape his past.
It is sad. If he'd slowed up, the hindsight saga, if he'd slowed up and taken it a bit easier earlier on, who knows? But he'd been rushing at it bull at a gate and maybe left the relaxing and slowing down too late.
To think that we'd lost both of Margaret and Les so early on in life, it makes you think if perhaps they hadn't had all this fame and they hadn't had the stress, and perhaps they might have been here today, but who knows?
His lost diaries gave us an insight into a private side few people really knew, an insight into the fears, the insecurities, the sense of failure that marked his life, and which perhaps ultimately drove him to a premature death. He may have died feeling a failure, but in fact he was one of the most respected and successful comics of his time.
Wilbur Genji has developed an ingenious...